Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah. So we just completed Maghrib here. Alhamdulillah. MashaAllah. A little bit longer than expected, but here we are. Welcome everyone. I see that we have, let's see, we got a good number of people here. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan. So, we're going to start, as I mentioned last time, with a review of what we had discussed last week, as well as some material that we had to finish that we just didn't get a chance to get to. So we'll go through that in the first half hour to 45 minutes or so, and then after that we will begin with our discussion of the actual derived rulings of fiqh as they pertain to the prayer, and hopefully we'll also get to fasting and zakat. So I have one funny thing with my slides, which is when I transferred them, I had to, they cut and pasted in backwards. So I'm just going to jump forward real quick and then move backwards through this. So there we go. Oops. So let me just start with, are there any questions that are left over from last time? I will do a quick review, but perhaps if there were questions, that the questions might help us to review. And as usual, please feel free to type them in, or just get on your microphone and ask away as well. Okay, so feel free to just drop them in if you have a question. I'll get started if you're typing something, and I'll address it once I see it. So as a reminder, last time we began discussing the subject of what is Sharia and what is a Sharia ruling. We went from the dimension of Iman in the first few weeks to now the dimension of Islam. And Islam deals with the dimension of the body, right? The dimension of the body. So what we're interested in now is the law of the limbs and ritual in society. So we discussed the different definitions of Sharia, regardless of all of the cultural implications, whether Muslim cultural implications or non-Muslim cultural implications, whether they are informed cultural implications or misinformed or uninformed cultural implications, whatever the cultural implications may be, what we are concerned with is this technical meaning, as the Sharia as the law that is determined by Allah. And I've put Islamic law as determined by Allah because that's primarily how we're going to use it. But if you recall, as a reminder, we also mentioned that we use the term Sharia for any prophet, right? And every prophet came with Islam. Every prophet came with Tawheed, right? So Islamic law is not as compared to Jewish law as compared to Christian law necessarily. It's Islamic law, the law of the prophet of the time, as determined by Allah. So that it's better. I'm sorry. It's better to say it is the law as determined by Allah, specific to the followers of a particular prophet of that time, right? So there is the Sharia of Moses. There is the Sharia of Isa, peace be upon them both. There is the Sharia of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. And this is God's law as revealed to these prophets. So the four core attributes of the prophets are they were honest, they obeyed. There's a question here. What are the four core attributes of the prophets? The prophets were honest, they obeyed, they conveyed, and were highly intelligent, right? So they didn't lie, right? They're honest, they didn't lie. They told the truth, always, right? They obeyed. There's this idea of trustworthiness, obedience to Allah. They're divinely protected from sin, right? They obeyed the commands of Allah and never went against them. Tabligh, or conveyance, right? They conveyed the message that Allah gave to them. So Allah gave them the message, which contained specific Sharia rulings for their particular time, as well as broad principles, right? They conveyed that and they were highly intelligent. So in order to understand the Sharia, right, in order to understand the law that Allah has set for the people, whether of a particular time and place, like the people of the Sharia of Moses, for example, or for all humans in all times, the Sharia that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they have to be highly intelligent in order to interpret this law. So these are mentioned in the Bajuri Risala, the short epistle that is in the syllabus and on the sorry, the typing's not working. The short epistle that's in the syllabus and on the learning management system. You can download it if you need a review. We've had a couple of different references to Bajuri, a couple of different references to Ghazali, but there's one that's called like the Epistle of Bajuri or the Risala of Bajuri, and there you can see that list again. Plus, we discussed it in detail on the recordings. Happy to unpack as needed. So the Sharia basically is the law that is revealed to these specific human beings who are honest, obedient to Allah, always conveying the message that's given to them, and highly intelligent in order to interpret this Sharia and apply it. We also mentioned the 5 aims of the Sharia, that the Sharia aims to protect at least these 5 things, right? Now there are more, right? There's more to this than just the protection of these 5, but these are like the most important things to keep in mind, right? So if there's a particular ruling, if there's a command or a prohibition, it's going to connect most likely to one of these 5 and perhaps something else. It could be spiritual purification, it could be building society, it could be reminding of Tawheed, of the oneness of Allah, right? But ultimately, the aims of the Sharia, the rules that applied to the limbs, right? To the hands, the feet, the tongue, the eyes, the nose, the ears, the private parts. These, did I mention the feet? Yeah, the feet, etc. So these are the sort of the inroads to the spiritual heart, right? That these limbs, what one puts upon these limbs, what actions manifest on these limbs will impact one spiritually. These 5 aims of the Sharia, these are the 5 aims of the rules for your limbs in society, in ritual and in society, right? And again, we mentioned these in greater detail last time. I'm just sort of reviewing for clarity since we had a number of technical difficulties, but do feel free to ask questions about any of these. We mentioned that there's an element to these that have to do with the rights of individuals and of human beings, in general, as well as responsibilities, right? So rights and responsibilities. So when you think about a ruling, it's going to apply to rights and responsibilities. Rights in general, we've mentioned, like, people like to think of these 5 aims as referring to like 5 universal human rights, like the right to life, the right to religion, the right to property, and so on. But we could also think in terms of the rights of Allah and the rights of His creation, right? So this also includes animal rights, right? And this also includes one's right, like Allah has certain rights over us. And sometimes a law that Allah reveals might be specifically within, the realm of divine rights, or I think, God's rights. So you'll want to think about that, rights and responsibilities. I have to do this. Well, what rights is this obligation protecting, right? And what responsibility am I, carrying out, in a sense, right? If I am prohibited from, drinking alcohol, for example, and driving, right? So in general, right, but also especially drinking and driving is a clear, case where we probably can all, agree within Islam and outside of Islam, right? Right. So yes, I am restricting my right to drink whatever I want, right? I'm putting a restriction on my own rights, but it's because somebody else has a right over me, right? And I have a responsibility to those people, right? Society has a right over me to be safe from me behind the wheel, intoxicated, right? So, I restrict my right. If I were to say, like, well, I'm a human being, I should be able to do whatever I want, whenever I want, and nobody should restrict me, right? Well, I have to restrict that supposed right because I have a responsibility to others, right? I have to respect the rights of other people to life, right? To property, right? Alcohol destroys, the abuses and misuses of alcohol destroy the intellect, right? Primarily, but also families and property and lives, right? So we want to look, when we're thinking about rules and regulations, what's being protected here? If I'm being restricted, what's being protected? On the one hand, right? But also, if I am being given or restricted, whatever it may be, what also, what do these actions, how do they pertain to my own personal rights, which are some greater rights that bring about a good that don't feel restrictive to me? We mentioned that fiqh linguistically means understanding, that it has a technical meaning of Islamic jurisprudence, that we're basically interested here in the derivation of the Sharia rulings, the rules, right, of Islamic law. Fiqh is that science. Now, something like the prohibition of praying to idols does not fall under the category of fiqh, because that's something that we don't need to discuss. We don't need to figure out if it's permissible or not, right? That is an essential point of the faith. Praying to an idol, right, contradicts Tawheed in the most obvious of ways, and is a form of shirk in the most obvious of ways, and so therefore, it's not something that needs to be discussed. It's not something that could have possible interpretations, right? Fiqh is the science of determining what is the ruling on this when it's not 100% clear, returning to the points of certainty in order to deduce what the ruling is in these areas of uncertainty, right? When does Asr begin, right? That's a debated position. We have hadiths that give us different information about that. We have interpretations of that give us information. Even if we know when Dhuhr technically starts, are we sure that we have that window from Dhuhr to Asr, or would perhaps some scholars say that you should pray right on time? Is there some debate about maybe the best times to pray within a time frame? Asr, for example, the Shafis say you should pray it really quickly, right on time when it comes in. The Hanafis consider it to be better to delay it until a certain point when the sun is at a certain point in the sky. In any case, so fiqh is the science that deals with these points where there could be some legitimate and important and ultimately merciful disagreements. We talked about the idea of fiqh, basically looking at an action, trying to determine what looking at all the variables within that action, and then fiqh is the science of determining what is the ruling for that action, right? So can I take medicine that has alcohol in it, right? Is it permissible to take? I know that I can't drink alcohol as just to have a glass of wine with dinner or something. I know that's not permissible. But what about the medicine where alcohol is used to extract medicinal properties, for example? Or what about taking a tablet that has gelatin in it? What are the rulings for something like that? We need to know, what does the Sharia say about those things when it's not clearly expressed in the Quran and in the Sunnah. So what is a legal Sharia ruling? We mentioned that there are the 5 main Sharia legal rulings that we're concerned with: obligatory or mandatory, recommended, neutral, disliked, and prohibited. The mandatory or the obligatory is that if you do it, you're rewarded. If you don't, you're punished. That's usually what they say in the text. And then somebody goes, hang on a second, wait a second. If you do it, you're rewarded. Well, perhaps you'll do a bad deed that erases it at some point, right? Perhaps a person leaves Islam, a'udhu billah, and then returns to Islam, and all of their past deeds are erased. So to speak with such definite language, it's kind of a shortcut. We want it basically, you've earned reward, and you've earned punishment, but it may be that by Allah's mercy, all the fard actions that you might have skipped or missed or not done properly, perhaps Allah will forgive them. So it's not that you absolutely will be punished or absolutely will be rewarded. But if you do a fard action, you've earned reward, and if you intentionally miss it, avoid it, skip it, it will be, it will count towards potential punishment. Mandub, if you do the action, you've earned reward. The recommended is if you do the action, you've earned reward. If you skip it, you have not earned punishment, right? It's not a sin to skip a mandub, or to miss it, to forget it, whatever it may be, to not do it, but it's rewarded if done. Something that's neutral, you do it, you don't do it, there's no reward or punishment associated with it. Makruh, disliked, if you do it, there's no punishment associated with it. If you intentionally avoid it while having the opportunity to do it, then you are rewarded. And haram, if you do it, you have earned. If you do it, you have earned punishment. But if you intentionally avoid it, then you have earned reward. Okay. So there is a question. Sure, I'll just go back to the first two slides when I finish this slide presentation, inshallah. If I forget, please remind me, Sister Shamsia. So we can generally think of the first four here as halal, and the second and the last one as haram, right? So, can I do this? The question is, can I do this? Can I pray Maghrib? Yeah, yes, you can pray Maghrib, and you better pray Maghrib, right? So yes, it's halal for you to pray. In fact, it's mandatory, right? Can I pray the Sunnah prayers? Yes, and you really should pray the Sunnah prayers. Can I, wear blue on Thursdays? Well, if you want, sure. No punishment associated, whatever, right? Can I, decorate the mosque with the, fancy gold, maybe not gold, I should say, with the fancy, beautiful designs, and, put complex, paintings all and decorations everywhere to make it beautiful? Some scholars would say, yeah, but it's better not to. You should keep it simple, right? Whereas others may have argued that it's permissible and in fact meritorious. That could be a point of disagreement. And then haram, that one's obviously in a different category. So that one you don't do. So again, makruh, yeah, if you do it, you haven't earned punishment. It would still be permissible to do it, but it's better not to. Oops. So I believe we also mentioned these. They may have been a bit rushed. There's 5 additional rulings that can be mentioned. They're not mentioned usually in a quick introductory lesson. You might not. In fact, I would recommend for those of you going into chaplaincy, you wouldn't in a quick intro to fiqh. You wouldn't want to get too deep into these topics. This is more just for people to get a sense of the bigger picture of the science of usul al-fiqh, the science of the sources of law. But we also talk in terms of the time of the sun going down, right? The sun going below the horizon but still having light in the sky. That is a cause for Maghrib to become obligatory. It's a sebeb, right? If the sun has not gone down yet, then the obligation to pray Maghrib has not yet occurred. So we'll talk about things like a particular variable in action, an external variable in the universe around us, like the position of the sun in the sky. That'll be a cause for something, right? You could also talk about conditions, like having done your ablutions, your wudu is a condition for a valid salah, a valid prayer. So that jumps over to the word valid or sahih, right? But it's a condition. If Maghrib has come in, has the sun gone down? Yes. Okay, that cause that makes Maghrib now an obligation has occurred, and now I want to pray Maghrib. Can I pray Maghrib yet? Well, have I done my ablutions yet? Right? Am I in a state of ritual purity? Right? That state of ritual purity is a condition for performing the obligation of the Maghrib prayer. And then you have like a mani', a preventative. This is something where a variable that prevents one from performing something. If a person, if a woman is experiencing postnatal bleeding after having given birth, for example, that would be a state that prevents her from praying. So not only can she not pray that prayer, she mustn't pray that prayer, and she's not obliged to pray that prayer, right? If the body is still going through that purificatory process, that process of purification. So that state of postnatal bleeding, for example, is a preventative to being able to pray the prayer. And then we have the other two that I put in green here, right, which have to do with valid and invalid. This is different from halal and haram. It's just a matter of whether or not it's considered like you've put all the pieces together. If it was an electrical circuit, if a particular action had multiple variables that had to be put in order in a particular way, and you plugged them all in properly, such that a light would light up at the end, that would be something that's valid, right? But if a circuit was in the wrong place, it would be invalid. So we haven't yet judged it to be a good action or a bad action or anything like that. We're primarily concerned with whether or not it counts, right? So, so we can talk about a valid transaction, right? A valid transaction. If there's a buyer and a seller, but the price hasn't been mentioned and there's been no exchange of money, just an exchange of the goods, for example, then we can't really consider that to have been a valid transaction yet, right? It's ambiguous. Was it a sale? Was it a loan? Was it a rental, right? We would need more information to know whether or not that transaction was valid. Marriages, a marriage contract could be a valid or invalid contract, right? If there were no witnesses to the marriage, you've contracted a marriage, but if there were no witnesses, then according to at least some of the schools, that would not be a valid contract. And some would say at least until you go and inform some witnesses after the fact. Anyway, so these are additional ways that we talk about actions, right? We don't have to get too deep into this now. It's just to get a taste of it. For those of you who are going to go on to further study of Islamic law, you're going to dig into this much deeper in a class on Usul al-Fiqh. Which I will read. Usul al-Fiqh. See if I can make sure it's clear for you for a moment there. Usul al-Fiqh. Those are the roots of the science of fiqh. But we're concerned mostly with getting into the subject of fiqh, which is about the actual branches that branch out of these root points. I won't get into that there. So, our four usul, our four sources of Islamic law, are the Quran, the Sunnah, the consensus, and the analogy, right? And I believe we mentioned all this, but again, I'm going through it again for clarity and review as well. So the Quran is the first and most important primary first source of determining whether an action is mandatory, recommended, neutral, disliked, or forbidden, right? Can I drink tea? Is it permissible to drink tea? It has caffeine. If I drink 16 cups of tea, does that count for intoxication, for example? Or, so it does have some kind of effect on me. Does that count as intoxication? And therefore, is it not permissible? Well, what does the Quran say? Does the Quran mention anything about tea? Okay, if the Quran doesn't say anything about tea, what about the Sunnah? Did the Prophet ﷺ drink tea? Did anybody in the Prophet's amongst the Sahaba, peace and blessings be upon him, and may Allah be pleased with them. Did they ever say anything about the Prophet having drank tea, or did they drink tea themselves? We might look to see if they were basing an action on something they learned from the Prophet ﷺ. If we haven't seen it in the Quran and the Sunnah is primarily the demonstrative example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. If we don't see it there, well, have the scholars discussed it, right? Have the scholars then said, we don't see it in the Quran, we don't see it in the Sunnah. We all have agreed that it's permissible by some other means that we'll mention later. If there's a total consensus on the matter, ijma', that can be a binding source of rules in Islamic law. If nobody ever disagreed with it, if once coffee, for example, when it entered into the Muslim ummah, there was discussion about it, right? Can we drink coffee? Is it an intoxicant? If it's not an intoxicant, does it lead to harm in society, right? There were discussions about this, and then eventually people came about to agree, but whether or not that reaches consensus is another story. There may be just a strong opinion, a strong agreement with some people who might have disagreed, or it may be that over time, after some discussion, everybody formed a consensus and agreed. But the idea is that when there is a full consensus, maybe it's, some people say just the consensus of the Sahaba, some people say the consensus of the Sahaba and the early scholars of Medina in Imam Malik's time. Others say all of the great scholars of the Ummah, at a particular time and place, if they all agreed on something, that would form a binding consensus. But in any case, it's one of the sources of Islamic law. For example, there's ijma', there's consensus that we must fast in the month of Ramadan, right? That the fast of Ramadan is one of the pillars. That's an area of consensus. And of course, these are things that are mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah as well. Then we have qiyas, or analogy, right? Which is where we say, okay, tea. If I drink tea, it might have a sort of stimulant effect. It might wake me up. But does that stimulant effect count as an intoxication, right? Is the effect of tea an intoxication? If there is the presence of intoxication, which is the reason for the prohibition of wine, right? If wine is not permissible to drink because of because of intoxication, then we would look to see if that variable of intoxication is present in something like drinking tea or drinking coffee, right? So analogy is where you look for the variable that is the reason for a prohibition or reason for a command or reason for any type of ruling, right? And then you look to see if that variable is present elsewhere. So if in another action that hasn't been mentioned, right? So if the Quran prohibits khamr or grape wine, why? Is it because of something with grapes, right? Well, we can still eat grapes, and we can still eat raisins, and we can still drink grape juice, and we can still drink, raisin juice, right? So it's not that it's a liquid made from grapes. It's the presence of the intoxication, right? And from that, we do analogy to any other intoxicating substance. So these are the four most important sources that we use to figure out which of the 5 legal rulings applies to an action. So drinking tea, can I drink it or not, right? I don't look. The great scholars look to primarily to these 4 categories or these 4 sources of Islamic law. But there's also some additional points that I have that are mentioned that are debated. And so it's not that the debate is the source. It's that there are roughly at least 9 or 10 more possible sources that people will use. Like, for example, they'll define it's called like the maslaha, the common good, right, or just the general good that might come from something. Is that something that we can look to as a source of law? That if something leads to good or harm, is that in and of itself like a variable to consider, right? And there's some debate about if you use that, how far-reaching can the consideration of the common good extend, right? So if somebody's like, well, I think it's against the common good to pray 5 times a day. I think we'd all be much happier if we only had to pray twice a day or something like that, right? And if somebody, and you had a whole bunch of people like, yeah, it sounds like a great point. I'll be much happier if I only pray. It's not going to work. That's not how it works there. Nobody would take that. However, if there is a rule in place, like for example, like a rule like the punishment for a thief, it may be that for the common good, the punishment for theft might be lessened if there are other variables that, when present, might lead to greater harm. Right? So we won't get too deep into that, but that's just one example of a debated source of law. So sometimes I go deep so that you all get the sense of how deep some of these topics can get. That's what the future study of these subjects will expose you to. You'll get much deeper into these. But I like to think of it as we're sort of taking a boat ride through this stuff, right? What you're responsible for right now is what's around the shallow areas and the surface, right? But when we put on the scuba gear and we dive deep, it's so you can get a sense of what some of the treasures and gems are down at the ocean floor. But this class is not a scuba diving class. Metaphorically speaking, you'll get deep into those topics when you study them in their own courses in detail. But it's good to have a sense of, we're talking about the science of fiqh, which is the derivation of the rules for specific actions based on the core sources of Islamic law, right? That's our primary concern here. So, and again, once again, forgive me, because for some reason, every time I move to some new computer, that some new issue comes up. So my slides were cut and paste, and they pasted backwards. So a lot of extra information you don't need. But anyway, I just had to fast forward through them to get to where I want to start. Are there any specific questions based on what I've just mentioned previously? By way of review, but also clarification, and perhaps there was something new in there. But I believe I covered all of that to some degree last time. Okay, please do let me know if there are some questions. So then we want to know, how do we know what the Sharia ruling is? What is this business of determining legal rulings? I've given you a hint with the subject of qiyas or analogy, but we want to get a little deeper. So we want to first, ask the question is, who is the lawmaker, right? Who makes the law, or the shari'? Who is the Sharia maker, right? Is it the human mind, right? Is it that human beings can just kind of figure out, like, this is good and this is bad, and I expect God to give me rules that correspond to my intellect's derivation of what's good or bad? That's not necessarily, not everybody thinks that way, but there are some people who think that the intellect alone is sufficient to determine the legal rulings. But we're not going to get into that question. Can a human being figure out whether or not alcohol is good or bad without divine revelation? If you remember our red epistemology, rational, empirical, divinely revealed, there is a question about, can the intellect use just the rational, the R channel, right, to determine whether or not something is good or bad? Some have said yes, some have said no. But we're going to go past that question and just say, well, who is going to lay down the law for us in the Sharia? So regardless of whether we think that we could have figured it out for ourselves without revelation, once the revelation has come, who in fact determines what these rulings are? Ultimately, of course, Allah is the lawmaker. Allah is the shari', right? The one who brings the Sharia. But also, sometimes we could say metaphorically that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is also a lawmaker if Allah has given him permission to give a particular ruling in a particular time and place. So there are certain things that were left up to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But ultimately it's because God has given him that choice, right? But ultimately, the command to prayer, right? The command to pray, the command to fast, the command, the commands against that prohibit, I should say, the prohibitions of theft, the prohibitions of adultery. These come from Allah, right? These are the rulings that were revealed by Allah. So primarily Allah is the lawgiver, and we would say that God declared the ruling for adultery to be that it is haram. God declared the ruling for the 5 daily prayers that they are mandatory, right? Now there's a significant body of the rules that we're going to read about in our books of fiqh that we can't say with such certainty, God declared the ruling to be such and such. It's rather that we're going to say, ultimately what we're saying is that a jurist deduced or figured out that God most likely has declared that the ruling for a particular matter is such and such, right? So like I mentioned earlier, coffee was an issue that people had some disagreement about when it first was introduced into like a place like Istanbul, right? So anybody who's been to Istanbul or been around Turkish people or other people who drink Turkish coffee or Arabic coffee, depending on where you are and what they call it, right? But when these things were first introduced into the predominantly Muslim lands of these areas, I think the Yemenis may have had it for a long time, certainly the Ethiopians had it for a very long time. But whenever these drinks were introduced into the Muslim world, they had a discussion about this, right? And so ultimately when we say that coffee is permissible, it's what we're saying is jurists have deduced from the primary sources of law and perhaps some secondary sources through an act of derivation that they are qualified to do, they have deduced that it is permissible to drink coffee, right? But do we always want to have that conversation? No. Is it permissible to drink coffee? Yes, it's permissible to drink coffee. How do you know? Well, the scholars have said so, right? That's where we're at right now in this discussion, and we'll continue to unpack. Feel free to ask questions at any point. If I'm going too fast through anything, also please feel free to ask me to repeat. So we can say that, when we are able to say, I've added 2 points that had question marks before. When we can say with certainty, when we can say that God, I should say this. When can we say God declared the ruling to be such and such? That's only when we have a ruling that's known with certainty, which is qat'i. And I believe I mentioned this last time. I don't remember if it was after the Isha prayer or before, but that we can divide generally things into categories of qat'i and dhanni, right? And qat'i is certain, and dhanni is probabilistic, right? It could be that we're 99% sure that the jurist's derivations are correct, that in fact God has declared the ruling to be such and such, or we're 75% sure, or we're 50% sure, right? Dhann in general has to do with probabilistic knowledge that tilts towards certainty, as opposed to tilting away from certainty, which we'd have different words for that. But basically we can think of qat'i and dhanni. Absolute, certain, on the one hand, and dhanni, probabilistic. We're saying it's probably the case, or there's a probability of such and such percent that it is the case, right? So when we're talking about something certain, yes, we can say God for sure has declared that the prayer is obligatory, right? God for sure has declared that grape wine is forbidden, right? But if we say that coffee is halal, what we're saying is that the best estimation of the qualified scholars is, through their process of deduction, using the primary sources of Islamic law, that it is permissible to drink coffee, right? Why? Because we don't have a certain absolute text from the Quran that is unequivocal, that can basically only be interpreted in one way. There's no text in the Quran that says coffee is permissible, right? Or something of similar, quality, right? So we've had to deduce it from the primary sources that was the ruling. So when that's the case, we're saying that we have some degree of certainty. We have some degree of confidence that it is probably the case that something is permissible or impermissible, right? So the question is, it's a helpful thing, especially for chaplains, in my personal experience and opinion. That even if you don't know the answer, you could do some research on it. But but also it's good to just be able to sit with a question and say, look, if I know for sure, you could tell somebody that you're working with. You could say if they have some doubts about something, right? Well, I grew up believing that this was an absolute part of Islam because I grew up in this part of the world. Then I met somebody from this part of the world who said that there was a difference of opinion about that, and that they followed a different opinion on that. All right, they should they should be able to feel comfortable, I should say, with the concept of dhann, but also sometimes you have a person who's Muslim, and they feel, they still believe, they don't deny anything about the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They don't deny the existence of Allah. They believe in the Quran as the word of Allah. But they're not convinced of certain details, right? They're not convinced that they need to do such and such, right? In that case, I have personally found, and perhaps you can check this with other people and see what other people's opinions are, but I have personally found that it's helpful to get a person to at least sit with the question and say, can I be certain, right, that this is a ruling in Islam? Right? And if I can't be certain, right, if perhaps there's some disagreement about it, if I'm uncomfortable with a particular ruling, if I think to myself, there's just no way this could be permissible in Islam, or there's just no way this could be haram in Islam, right? Until one has reached the level of certainty that there's absolute agreement on this question, then it's okay for them to say, I'm going to sit with the question for a while and wonder, right? I'm going to wonder if playing string and wind instruments is permissible or not. I'm going to wonder whether or not drinking coffee is permissible or not. Not that one has to constantly be in that state. But especially when a fiqh ruling is attached to a person's faith, right? When a person's like, because people leave religions based on fiqh, ultimately, fiqh rulings, right? I've met Jewish people who were once Jewish until they learned that this was an opinion of the early, Hebrews or something, or Muslims who they were Muslim until somebody told them this was the ruling for something, and they said that can't be, and they left, right? So since fiqh rulings can be tied to a person's strength of faith, or even to whether they believe or not, it's, I think, helpful for a person to think about, look, if Allah said, and you were 100% sure that Allah said to you that this was permissible or that this was impermissible, what would your response to that be, right? And if you can't reach that point, then perhaps it is the case that it sits in the category of probabilistic, and you can press pause on that and wonder about it, right? And then focus, on what you're certain about. And even if that makes you technically a bearer of heretical beliefs, according to the sort of mainstream scholars, it may be that for a particular individual, it's very helpful for them just to focus on coming to the prayers and fasting in Ramadan, and doing what they can, even if they have some major doubts about some other point. So, really realizing that not every claim to Islam is a certain claim, right? To realize that it's possible for there to be sometimes disagreement, or even if it's a majority of people consider the ruling to be such and such. A particular thing that it's still sometimes there's a small group of people that disagreed, and that the existence of that disagreement might be like a sort of a pressure valve, right? That for a person who's kind of struggling, it allows them to let some pressure off and say, okay, well, maybe on this particular position, this feels more comfortable for me, right? Even if somebody else would say that's totally wrong, right? As long as there's some justification for it, if it's an area where there's not absolute certainty, sometimes that awareness can be helpful for a person. Excuse me. So what does the jurist do? Is an important question. So the person who figures out these questions, we're interested in determining who that person is and what is it that they do. We're interested in the jurist, the person who goes to the primary sources and extracts the rulings from them, right? The rulings that require some discussion. If it's absolutely certain, we don't have to get into the fiqh discussion. We don't need to do any derivation there. It's certain, it's in the Quran, there's no disagreement about it, there's no other ways to interpret it. But for a significant portion of what is considered Islamic law, a lot of that's going to be in the category of fiqh rulings, where the science of fiqh, the scholars of fiqh have gone to these primary sources and deduced the rulings. What does it mean to deduce the rulings? This is the subject of ijtihad, which we can translate here as research and derivation for simplistically. But ultimately it's about the struggle to deduce and extract something that is not known. Right? So linguistically, it's about investigating, it's about striving, it's about trying to deduce and figure out. It comes from the same root jahada, from which we get jihad, which means struggle, linguistically means struggle. So the ijtihad is to investigate, to strive, to understand, right? Technically, in the context of Islamic law, here we're talking about deriving rulings from the Quran and Sunnah using a specific methodology, right? So that is to say that we might identify a particular core, what are the core sources that we're going to derive our rules from, and then we're going to have a method of how we approach those rules, right? So Imam Shafi'i and Imam Abu Hanifa had different methods of approaching the same Quran, right? They both considered the Quran the primary source, but they had different different methods of interpreting certain ayahs that allowed for a difference of interpretation, right? So for something simple is like if something is commanded, right? There are certain things where if there's a command in the Quran, it uses the grammatical command, something of do this particular action. There might be a disagreement about whether or not that is a obligatory command or a recommended command, right? So in certain matters, the two or more scholars could disagree about whether or not to consider a command in the Quran or in the Hadith literature to be an obligatory command, one that you must do, or a recommended command, right? So they're going to have a specific methodology for approaching the Quran and Sunnah and the other core sources that we've mentioned, right? Culturally, both in the Western academic culture and pseudo-academic culture, as well as in certain modern Muslim circles, when we use the term ijtihad, sometimes they mean it more generally as like interpretation, right? Well, or free thinking, or independence of thought, right? So if you say, look, only certain people can do ijtihad, then some people will be like, hey, hang on a second, we all have intellects, and the Quran tells us to use our intellect. So if I have an intellect, I can interpret the Quran myself, and I can, figure things out. I can think independently. We're not saying that people can't think independently, people can't ask questions and have legitimate, interpretations and analyses and informed questions. But the argument here from the scholars that I'm teaching from is that only people who meet the requirements of ijtihad can do ijtihad, right? And I think a good practical proof of this is that when everybody starts preaching their own interpretation of something, we end up with a lot of interpretations, some of which are far-fetched and not even justifiable according to the language or otherwise, right? So it does provide certain restrictions. Not everybody will agree with this, right? There are people in our communities, and perhaps in the class, I don't know people's perspectives. There are some people who might opt for a more independent, individualistic approach to the Quran, where each individual approaches the Quran and takes from it what they want and what they need. But here I'm teaching from a perspective that I think allows for both an expansive and diverse pool of interpretations, as well as keeps us from going far out, off course or out of the park. It gives a certain amount of restriction while leaving a tremendous amount of, restriction for the sake of safety, while leaving a tremendous amount of room for variation and possible opinion. So keep that in mind. This is my particular approach. Not everybody will agree with this. Some people will say, don't even talk about ijtihad, don't even talk about madhabs, just quote the Quran, quote the Sunnah, and that's enough. Do so authoritatively, and people will think you're correct, right? I don't personally take that approach. So just to, I am of the opinion that we can move comfortably, safely, and effectively through life using the scholarship of those qualified to do ijtihad. So there's a whole bunch of qualifications, and we're not going to get into all of them now. Just be aware that this is a discussion that happens. But at bare minimum, when you have somebody who's like, I did my own interpretation of the Quran, and you say, well, do you speak Arabic? And they say, no, I looked at the English translation and did my own. I mean, I've seen tenured professors in conferences at Harvard saying this sort of thing. So I did my own, tafsir, my own interpretation, and somebody said, do you speak Arabic? No, I don't speak Arabic. Okay, that's interesting, really interesting, interpretation of a translation, but is the translator correct, right? Are there multiple possible linguistic interpretations here? Anyway, so Arabic, strong command of Arabic, the science is associated with Arabic, the science is associated with the Quran, the science is associated with the Hadith, but also, I should say, also the knowledge of the context, the time, place, and population, right? Oops. So you don't worry about copying all this stuff down. Just as an example, Arabic has at least 25 associated sciences at this point. Like, you have to understand morphology, which is how the words, are. It can take 3-letter roots that then take on different forms. Nasra, Yansru, Nasran, Nasr, Mansur, all from the 3-letter root of Nasara. There's a science called sarf that's associated with that. Then there's syntax, which is the ends of words. fil bayti as opposed to fil baytu or fil bayta, right? How the ends of words can express a meaning. We have to be aware of that science. Whether or not words are used metaphorically, and if so, what are the rules for metaphorical usage? What are the root meanings of words? A whole bunch of different sciences. The Quran also will have multiple sciences associated with it, which are even smaller here. But the point is, and we don't have to get into all of them, there's a lot of sciences and topics and concepts associated with each of these categories: Arabic, Quran, Hadith, and so on. We need somebody who has the qualifications, who's going to recognize when something is general and applicable to all times and places, or perhaps just providing general principles, right? Or when something in the Quran is speaking to a specific time and place, when it's speaking specifically to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and whether or not it's possible for us to extract a ruling that could be applied to others from that, or just the general principle, or whatever it may be. The question is, will we break for Isha? The adhan for Isha here will happen any second now, I think. But the prayer in Jamaat will be at 8 o'clock here. So we will, as usual, come back after Isha for any questions and answers. But we're going to plow through until 8 p.m. And there's no harm in delaying Isha until that time. If you're in a place where everybody's praying Isha all together, it might be better to join the Jamaat. But otherwise, we'll teach on through until the Iqama for Isha, inshallah. So again, this is just a bunch of, we're not going to get into all the details, but just be aware that for each of these things that there are specific sub-disciplines. There are additional sciences. For hadith, you have to know whether narrators were truthful or not. So there's a whole science of the truthfulness of narrators. Determining whether or not this person met the other person. Is it, so-and-so says Ahmed heard from, Mansur, but did Ahmed and Mansur ever meet? Well, Ahmed lived in Baghdad and Mansur lived in Khorasan, and they never, traveled or whatever, and so therefore never met. Whatever it may be. So these are sciences that a person has to study in order to really engage with the hadith. So this practice of just going to the hadith, quoting hadith, saying, "Brother, the hadith is clear, follow it," that's not actually how it works. One has to have qualifications with hadith. And then also there are different methods for interpreting and applying them. So who does this? The mujtahid. So the mujtahid is the person who is the master jurist, the one who can do ijtihad, and who has the qualifications, who knows those particular sciences I just mentioned. We can call them master architects, and we can divide. Let me see. I think I might have double clicked this. We can divide mujtahids into the master architect jurists, the mujtahids who could create their own toolbox and identify what tools they wanted to put into that toolbox, right? And then we have the lesser jurists, so the lesser mujtahids, who were restricted to using that toolbox, and often restricted to whatever that scholar built with them, metaphorically speaking, right? So just be aware that when we use the term mujtahid, for the time being, when we use the term mujtahid, we are talking about generally scholars with high levels of qualifications. But please keep in mind that there are levels for mujtahids, that somebody like Imam Shafi'i in the Shafi'i school is at a higher level than Imam Nawawi, right? Even if Imam Nawawi disagrees with Imam Shafi'i, and even if the Shafi'is, the followers of that madhab, that school of law, tend to follow Imam Nawawi against Imam Shafi'i's ruling, that's totally normal, and it's totally valid because even the lesser mujtahids were able to use the tools and assess and determine when, which rulings were, which opinions of different jurists were stronger. So just be aware that there are different levels of mujtahids, and at some later point, I've got the slides here, you can look at them, you can think about them, you can refer back to your readings on them. Just be aware that there are different levels of scholars, that not by identifying somebody as a scholar, like I went to a website and there was a mufti who gave me a fatwa, that person is not going to be at the same level as Imam Shafi, right? But it doesn't mean that they aren't qualified to necessarily, it doesn't mean that they are not necessarily qualified to give you a ruling. They might only be qualified to narrate a ruling as opposed to assess your situation and figure out the ruling for it. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha So, in our categories of scholars, we have those who are the founders of madhabs. Madhabs are basically schools following the methods and often certain rulings of a particular scholar, but ultimately it's about the toolbox. It's the method that they develop, what tools they put in that toolbox, and how they apply them, right? What kind of screwdrivers they use and how they use them, right? What kind of hammers they use and how they use them, right? Their toolboxes might have some similar tools. They might all have hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches, right? But one of them might have some additional tools that the other one doesn't have, or they might use the same tools in different ways, right? So the founders can create their own toolboxes and apply them and build rulings, right? Build analyses of the texts and apply them in an unrestricted way. That is to say that they have full freedom because of their knowledge to interpret the Quran, of course within the restrictions of the language and so on and whatever. But the idea is that they have reached the highest level of interpretation. So Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is listed as one of the mujtahids of the Sahaba. And like Umar radiallahu anhu, one of the mujtahids of the Sahaba, right? As opposed to some of the thousands upon thousands of other Sahaba who did not achieve the level of ijtihad, right? We saw that some Sahaba relied on other Sahaba, to other companions of the Prophet, to help them figure out what is the ruling on a particular matter. And then we also saw sometimes that two different Sahaba could disagree on a matter, right? And that was all considered valid. So, that's what we need to know for now. There's, of course, more to it. So when these scholars form a method and a methodology and a set of rulings, and they teach it to other people, and you've got enough people sort of following that, you generally call that a madhab. A madhab is just the way of going. It's, dhahaba means to go. It's the way they went. It's how they rolled. It's how they did things, right? It was their method, their school. And what we have over time is that different people tend to follow one madhab in one locale, at least for a while, and then they follow another, and then others follow another madhab in another locale, at least for a time, right? So Malikis tend to be in this area, and Shafis tend to be in this area, and Hanafis tend to be in this area, and it may have been different 1,000 years ago, right? But the majority of Istanbulis, everything's good, thank you. The majority of people, the Turks from Istanbul tend to be, from the western parts of Turkey, tend to follow the Hanafi school. In the eastern part, the predominantly Kurdish populations tend to follow the Shafi school. West Africa, Northwest Africa tend to follow the Maliki school. These are the madhabs, the schools that are built off of the methods and rulings of these foundational founder scholars, as well as the additional discussions and derivations and rulings that came from other scholars from amongst their students and their students' students and on down the line until today. There are other questions like, well, do we have to follow a madhab in everything? Generally it's advisable just, to follow the madhab of your area. If you're in a place like America where everything's all mixed up, it's best to learn from one madhab first. If you have some issues with it, if it seems difficult to apply given your context, maybe you'll look to a scholar of another madhab to help you figure it out. But in general, the average person follows the madhab of their mufti, the person who gives them the fatwa, right? So the imam of this mosque, I believe, is Maliki, right? And if you live in this town, and when you speak to the imam here, he answers the questions in a way that feels like he understands your time, place, and cultural context, right? You might say, okay, I'm just going to ask the imam. If the imam says this, I'm going to follow him. If he says that, I'm going to follow him, right? And then you're Maliki in all those questions that you ask. But then let's say you moved to upstate New York, and upstate New York tends to find a lot of people who are Hanafi, right? A lot of the Muslims in the area that I used to live were Hanafi, right? And so then you have another set of new questions, and you go to that imam, and they give you the answer according to the Hanafi school. Whether they've defined it as Hanafi or Shafi doesn't necessarily matter as long as it's actually in one of those madhabs. So then on those issues, then you're following the Hanafi school. The average person will follow the mufti, will follow the person who's giving them the informed, reasoned, valid opinions, and it wouldn't matter if some of it was from one madhab and others were from another. However, for those who seek to go down the path of sacred knowledge and also seek to travel a higher path of spirituality, then you start to have people saying, look, you should learn one madhab, learn it well, practice that madhab. Don't mix and match between other madhabs unless there's a real solid necessity. Don't borrow from other madhabs unless there's a real necessity in your life. That has to do with a person's, especially a student of knowledge and a person who's seeking a higher spiritual path. So many of the scholars that we might study with will say, choose a madhab, study that madhab. And that's quite often because they want you to excel on your path of knowledge, but also on your spiritual path. But for the average person, if you said, look, follow the Shafi'i madhab, and that's it, and don't go to any other madhab, that could create a lot of hardship for a lot of people. So a lot of average people are able to do it in certain times and places, but in other times and places that can create a hardship that can lead to harm, right? And so when harm is to be avoided, therefore it is permissible, according to many of the scholars, to follow multiple madhabs on different issues, right? This has to do with following different madhabs on different issues. I can pray according to the Shafi'i school in the morning, and I can pray according to the Maliki school in the evening, and as long as I've met all the conditions of the Shafi'i school in my morning prayer, and I've met all the conditions of the Maliki school in my evening prayer, it won't matter if I'm Hanafi in the morning and Maliki in the evening. In general, right? That's in general. We can talk about that more in detail as we dig deeper into the subject of fiqh. So we have these four main remaining schools, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali schools. The scholars that I've studied with generally tend to recommend for the student of knowledge to choose one and follow that. And then somebody says, well, which one should I follow? If you're from a traditionally Muslim family, right, and everybody in your neighborhood, tends to be Maliki, for example, like if you're, let's say if you're Senegalese or you're Moroccan, right? These are places where the Maliki madhab has had a strong foundation for a very long time, and unless a person has been exposed to internet Islam or satellite TV Islam and some kind of more mix and match, or whatever, modern versions that are not necessarily bad, that might still be totally rooted in one of these four schools, but with some mixing around. For the most part, the madhab of those regions tend to be Maliki, right? If you're from like Syria, if you're from Jordan, Palestine, these areas tend to be, for the most part, Shafi with some Hanafi as well. If you're from, most of Turkey, if you're from most of the Indian if you're from the Indian subcontinent, most of the people from those places tend to be Shafi. Of course, there are representations from Malikis and Hanafis and Hanbalis as well. So many scholars just recommend choose the one that makes the most sense for you, and follow that one. So then Sudan is a mix of Maliki and Shafi, but with Wahhabism, now they're in the picture. there are some fringe Hanbalis, as Sister Hala has mentioned. So I can't speak any authoritatively on how that plays out in society. It's not at all uncommon for like a family to be one family to follow the Shafi madhab and another family to follow the Maliki madhab. The Maliki madhab has an old history in that region, to the best of my knowledge at least, and I could be wrong about this, but to the best of my knowledge about that, the Maliki madhab has an old history in that region, and the Shafi'ization of the region comes gradually later on through the Al-Azhar about close to 1,000 years or 800 years ago. But in any case, that's the sort of those are the main practices. It may be that there's some kind of merging. I find that like the Shafis from Eastern Turkey who live in Istanbul long enough start to become kind of Hanafi on certain issues as well. So there can be some kind of hybrid forms, and all that's fine as long as the particular action follows the conditions of that particular school. And then once you bring like Wahhabism and modernism and other modern, semi-modern forms into the picture, then you find more diversity. In India, for example, in southern India, I was very surprised. Somebody from a college there contacted me who'd been reading some of my articles, and I looked at the website for their college, which is a very traditional Indian madrasa kind of college, and I looked at the map just to see where they were. I was sort of nerding out on Google Maps, and I saw like here is one type of madrasa, here's another type of madrasa, here's another type, all within this small, southern Indian region. So there's a lot of diversity, and the spread of the Salafi or Wahhabi teachings has gone all around the world, largely because of the funding from oil. But as long as they're following opinions that are valid according to the Hanbali school, the theological and political issues we can set aside for now. So when you have, but if so a lot of modern so-called Salafis or so-called Wahhabis tend to often be followers of the Hanbali school, and it's really more on certain positions within Aqida that they tend to be more what's called Salafi. And then so great. So yes, mostly Maliki. So mostly Maliki in Sudan. And then what happened to the others? Well, at some point there may have been up to like 200 madhabs. After this is after the time of Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal. There's like the Jariri madhab. There's or the Tabri's madhab. There's the Zahiri madhab. There's I'm forgetting the names, but a lot of the sort of the standard texts on Usul al-Fiqh will mention about 13 Sunni madhabs, but the idea is that only 4 were transmitted to enough people over time. Think about what it took to take a book of fiqh, right? Let's say you had a 500-page book with all these rulings in it. Somebody copies them down, teaches them to another. You have to have a lot of people teaching and copying before the printing press, right, to transmit a madhab. So other madhabs just didn't have enough followers ultimately, and it could be a generation, it could be 2 generations, it could be a couple hundred years, but over time, because they didn't have enough followers to serve the madhab, to serve the school, the texts and the teachings just didn't reach us fully, right? So we have remnants of them in comparative books of fiqh, right? So Averroes or Ibn Rushd has a book called the Distinguished Jurist's Primer, and therein he'll talk about various different opinions from different madhabs. And even the later schools would say this particular early madhab said this, but here's the main opinion. But basically it's not it doesn't mean that these 4 madhabs are better than the other madhabs. It's just that we don't have all of the books and teachings and rulings of those other madhabs because they weren't passed down. But these 4 madhabs are sufficient. They were mass transmitted from their founders, and they had large numbers of people in every generation who continued to transmit them and work on them and analyze them and apply them to contemporary times, thus producing an ocean of texts and rulings and interpretations that we can benefit from, and they're all valid, and we can follow any one of them that brings us closer to Allah. So Sister Shamsia, I hope that answers your question. Sister Hala, I still don't understand how people come to pick a madhab. Do you have to pick one? Do you have to stick just to that respective school's rulings, or can you mix and match? I also would like to know how people come to pick which creed to follow, Ash'ari, etc. Good. So some scholars say, yes, just you have to have a madhab, and you should only just learn one, follow that, and you should only go to other madhabs if there's a need. So Shafi'is, if you grow up in Yemen, everybody's Shafi, just follow the Shafi'i madhab. But when you go on Hajj, on a crowded Hajj, for example, the ruling in the Shafi school is that if a man's skin comes into contact with a woman's skin whom he is not his, other than his mother, sister, or daughter, that skin-to-skin contact breaks wudu or ablution, right? And on a crowded Hajj, that might be basically impossible. So you're going around the Kaaba, you bump your hand against another person's hand of the other gender, and then what are you going to do? Like make your way through 3.5 million people to go make wudu, or to tap the earth and do tayammum, or something that's not possible? So they say in a situation like that, if you're Shafi, just follow the Hanafi school on that. That doesn't break your wudu according to the Hanafi school. That's the opinion of those who are very strict about madhabs. Others are just forget it, don't even talk about madhabs. It's just going to confuse people. We need unity. Let's just, but then you end up still with the Imam of this mosque saying one thing and the Imam of this mosque saying another. So I opt on the side of having an informed and literate approach to this. But you can choose the one generally that's easiest for you to learn, right? I always wanted to learn the Maliki school. I always felt very attracted to the Maliki school. But Allah kept sending me Shafis, no matter what I did. I turned left, there's a Shafi. I turn right, there's a Shafi. I go all the way to Turkey, there's a Shafi. So wherever I go, it's Shafis who take the time to teach me, and may Allah forgive those Malikis who didn't take the time to teach me. But anyway, I'm just kidding. I mean, I of course want their forgiveness, but anyway. So it doesn't matter ultimately which one you choose. There can be some good guidance, like if your parents are Shafi'i, then don't mess things up at home, by following the Maliki school and shaking things up. Some people will just say, learn the madhab of your location. I had a friend who was born, who's from a Pakistani family, but from a Shafi region and a Shafi family. And when he got really interested in getting stricter, and not stricter, but more committed to his studies in Islam through the lectures of Hamza Yusuf back in the 90s, he went to Morocco with Hamza Yusuf and a bunch of other people, and said, and started learning Maliki fiqh. And he came home praying like a Maliki with his hands to his side. And his dad was like, "What are you doing? We're Shafi. This is what we." So he said, "Okay, whatever. I'll just be Shafi." So it doesn't matter. They're all valid. You might consider social variables, right? It can be easier to be Hanafi in certain contexts. Every dog that walks down my street, my daughter has to pet. So it's better for me to know the Maliki school, even though I study the Shafi school, but because dogs are considered ritually impure in 3 of the 4 schools of law. If that dog comes up and gets saliva on my hands or my clothes, I'd have to wash 6 times with water, and a 7th time with water mixed with mud or earth or sand in order to purify my clothing. In the Shafi school, so because of my particular context of my daughter chasing after every dog in the neighborhood, then it makes more sense for me to know the Maliki madhab if I need it, right? But most of the time I try to go Shafi because that's what I ended up studying. So it's not a big deal. You should go with what's easiest to learn, and what you feel also brings you closest to Allah, right? Sometimes people have faith-related issues connected to certain things in fiqh, and so it is the case that sometimes some Westerners lean towards the Maliki school because of certain rulings and certain aspects of their usul. And if that's important to you, great. But if it's not, then follow the one that brings you closest to Allah. If you own a store and you're buying and selling, and you're always coming into contact by giving people change, for example, right? And you've got to make 4 of the 5 prayers in a 5-hour period in the middle of winter, and you're buying, you might not have time to go do wudu every time you touch skin to skin with a person of the opposite sex. So in that case, the Shafi school might not be the best thing for a person, and it's good for them to learn the conditions of the Hanafi school and the ways of praying the Hanafis according to the Hanafi school, so that they can take their 3-minute prayer break if that's all their boss allows them to do, for example, or if they own the place, whatever it may be, right? So some like Said Nursi talks about like the wisdom of these madhabs, that like in like the regions where he was from, where I think from what, if I recall correctly, in certain places, the men and the women might not have interacted, as often during the day, so it was possible you didn't have to worry about breaking your ablutions, right? But in the cities like Istanbul, it made sense. People were buying and selling in the market. The Hanafi school made a lot more sense for that context. So there can also be bigger kind of contextual variables to consider, social variables, societal variables. But on a personal level, just learn one, and if you made it that far, and you say, well, look, I need to follow another school because of some hardship, then you learn that one in that particular manner. Just depends on how deep you want to get into this. If you just want to get on with your life, make sure your prayer is valid according to one school, and if you find hardship in one, maybe another one will offer you some ease so that you can get onto the more important things instead of constantly worrying about your ablutions, for example. And as far as picking a creed, ultimately you don't pick a creed you believe, right? Creeds are things to be believed, and then the scholars have passed down, here are the main points of creed. The Sunni creed are the points of agreement between the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, and the Atharis, right? The Sunni creed, what Sunnis must believe in order to be within the realm of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, are the points of agreement between the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, and the Atharis, these 3 schools of creed that we talked about, I think, in the first day of class. And by Athari, we're basically talking about the early scholars that the Salafi movements tend to refer back to. Now, the areas where they disagree, those tend to be in areas that require some contemplation and interpretation, and in those issues, it's not as crucial which opinion you choose. But what's advisable is to study the one that is predominant in your area. So, again, like in Sudan, Malikis and Shafis historically have been also Ash'aris in their Aqida. So you study an Ash'ari creed, and that's all you need. If you want to get deep into the subject, then that's for the scholars at a different level. If you're Hanafi, the vast majority of Hanafis have been Maturidi. So you study the Hanafi Maturidi texts and you call it a day and you don't worry about it. If you're Hanbali, then often but not always Hanbalis have been associated with the Athari creeds. Some of those tend to get a little bit more controversial from the Ash'ari Maturidi perspective. But there are enough valid and not so controversial creeds within that sort of Hanbali Athari creed category that would be valid to follow. And with all due respect and apologies to anybody who feels that's the very best way and they have issues with the Ash'ari Maturidis, it's obviously my perspective and I lean towards a particular perspective. So who is the author of the Distinguished Jurist Primer? His name in Arabic is Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd. Let's see. Ibn Rushd, pardon my both English and Arabic. And in the West, because he was a very important author on philosophy, they Latinized his name as Averroes, but his book was called the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, or the Distinguished Jurist Primer. It's not a place to start from. It's not like an introduction to fiqh. It's not an introduction to Islamic law. It is for the advanced. But just be aware that text exists, and you don't want to just jump into it without some guidance. Following rulings of different madhabs. Has this been... I'm not sure, Sister Nur Jahan, rulings of different madhabs, has this been translated in English? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you're referring to a specific book that catalogs them. I think maybe you're talking about the Distinguished Jurist Primer. That has been translated into English as the Distinguished Jurist Primer. and I think there's like at least 2 translations out there. They're not, all translations have issues. Don't take those translations as absolute fact, and do keep in mind that they get very deep into issues. I found it helpful as a new Muslim when I was, struggling with certain issues. I would try to see if there was any reference in any of those books to disagreement between scholars, so that I would, if somebody was saying, no, this is the opinion and you have to follow this opinion, I did find, if I could work my way through the text and find a differing opinion, it often helps to say, okay, you know what, it's broader than this. I might not figure it out today myself, but at least I know there's some disagreement and discussion about this. Do these schools have to do with time, place, and population, or did they all emerge at the same time? Great question. In general, the 4 schools that happen to have passed down to this time, they're generally organized here chronologically according to the birth of the scholars. So Imam Abu Hanifa was before Imam Malik, but I believe Imam Malik was, he was born before Imam Abu Hanifa died, I believe. Yes, he was. But Imam Shafi may have been born the same year as Imam Abu Hanifa. But Shafi studied with Malik. Malik studied with some of the core students of Abu Hanifa. Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Imam Shafi were in contact with each other. So they're all generally of the same time period. There were madhabs that existed earlier. There were madhabs that existed later, but these are the 4 that have been passed down. And also, especially with regard to the Hanafis and the Malikis, they represent the growth of earlier what are called regional schools that were followed in the particular region and might not have had a name until later on. Again, I mentioned this in my book on al-Bajuri called The Archetypal Sunni Scholar. I summarized some of it there, I think probably in the first, somewhere in the first 3 chapters. And then many others have written about it as well. But yeah, and it's important to keep in mind that they are ruling on certain issues according to the time, place, and population. Imam Abu Hanifa, they were often called the what-ifers, because they would say, well, what if this particular situation arose? And others would say, no. Only rule on what's actually happening now. Just leave it at that. But they'd say, well, what if? And somebody would say, well, what if like somebody was praying on like a board that's floating? Which way should they face, right? And and they had an answer to that. So then, when the question came along, about praying on an airplane, it may be that the Hanafis had a nice, robust precedent to refer back to, because they got into a lot of the what-ifs. Those what-ifs that might not have to do with time, place, and population. But then as time goes on, the scholars discuss how should this be applied in our time, in our place, in our population, right? And so therefore you might have differing rulings from the early Malikis and the later Malikis on a certain issue. And later on, a particular ruling becomes more popular than another. Good. So I think, and if there's more questions, feel free to send those in. I do want to make sure we at least get started on the fiqh portion, the actual rulings, but we have time and it's set up in order for us to expand as needed. Also there are Shi'i schools that would be other important madhabs, right? So the Ithna Asharis, the 12 Shias, like of Iran and Iraq, they're called the 12 or Ithna Ashari Shias. They have a madhab called the Ja'fari madhab. It goes back to Ja'far ibn Sadiq, the great grandson, or I forget how many generations down, of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Ibadis are another sect of Shi'is. The Zaydis are another sect of Shi'is, and each one of them have their own legal methodologies as well. And these are rich and robust traditions that a person who studies comparative fiqh digs into. But for our purposes, and especially in the context of chaplaincy, it's good to know what you follow, and then have a good solid awareness. And that would be something for those of you who enroll in the chaplaincy program. You will learn intellectual history, because as a chaplain you're going to have Shi'i students, you're going to have Salafi students, you're going to have Sunni students of various different madhabs, you're going to have modernist students, you're going to have unaffiliated Muslim students, you're going to have all different varieties, and it's good to have knowledge of that, because again, as a chaplain, you're there to serve them spiritually, and that doesn't always entail proving that you're right, on an issue, right? So it's good to be aware of the diversity of opinions. There's something called the Amman message, like Amman Jordan, that has a nice sort of statement about the validity of the 4 Sunni schools, as well as some other Sunni approaches, plus these 3 Shi'i schools. But anyway, we'll talk about that. It doesn't mean that you should go and take rulings from outside of the Sunni schools. It just has to do with whether or not they're considered valid, even if disagreed upon paths. I'm just going to, I'm not taking a break, I'm just going to double check something with Brother Sidge just to see about the next PowerPoint, if it's there. If not, give me 1 second, I'll be right back. Okay. Okay. Sister Shamsia had asked for the first 2 slides. Let me see if I can find those. Find those easily. Yeah, I think these were the first 2 that you're talking about. So I'll put this one up for a moment. Oops. Yeah, so I'm trying to just get everything before me here. So I may not have access to this other PowerPoint that I had expected to have. And I also don't see. Anyway, unfortunately, there are 2 new technical issues to work out here. Are there any remaining questions on this, the new material that I've introduced here, as well as the review that we did earlier on? And here was the second one. Yes, these are these are slides from the previous class that we just had reviewed. Okay, good. So, yeah, PDFs are not working here. One second. All right. So I will move on. We're going to move away from these slides now and enter into the discussion of the text called Safinat an-Najah, which is This is a text in the Shafi'i school, right? So we had our 4 schools of law. If I can get to them quickly, I will remind you of them. But we had our 4 schools of law. Actually, I'll skip over that. The 4 schools of law: the Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools, right? So I've chosen a text from one of those 4 schools, the Shafi'i school. I will tell you that personally, I find that in my personal life, I need to be aware of like the Hanafi school's rulings on certain things, or the Shafi'i school's rulings on certain things. Or that Maliki school's rulings on certain things. But for the past however many years, I have been primarily studying with scholars of the Shafi'i school. So I've chosen this text because it's a dependable text that is meant as an introduction, keeping in mind that these sort of introductory texts are often taught to younger people, right? But in a madrasa curriculum, right? If you're starting around the age of 12 or 13 or 14, on to age 20 to 22, which, by the time you're 22, 23, you're often ready to be an imam in these traditional methods. But so this is a text that comes from Yemen. The second reason I chose this, so I'm familiar with the Shafi'i school, number one, so I've studied that one most in depth. Number two, it was freely available, and I wanted to try to make as many of the texts freely available as possible. So it was copyright free. Excuse me, it was copyright free and available on the internet. So that said, when you take a text like this, think about this idea of time, place, and population, right? In looking at the footnotes, and even some of the rulings, there's some stuff that might kind of stand out, right, as a little bit strange. Like, what? Hold on, wait, why? Why are we even talking about this, right? Keep in mind, that we're talking about, societies that look very different from our own at the time that some of these texts are written, and even currently, there's tremendous differences. So, number one, be aware of that. Number two, sometimes you'll read something in these texts that kind of stands out as a bit shocking, right? And obviously at the time that they're writing them, they might not have thought them to be shocking, but culturally they could be shocking to us. Or in translation, they present a meaning that's really not as accurate as possible, as intended. So one of the things that stands out is, when must a person learn the rules of prayer, the ablutions before prayer? When must a person start praying, right? And so let's say, at the age of 7 or so, because that's the age of what's called the mumayyiz, they're able to distinguish. They're basically able to clean up after themselves, feed themselves. In my daughter's case, ask high-level intellectual questions about theology. But in any case, the idea is that they're rationally at a level where, they're not really in that purely imaginative realm. Like a 3-year-old can't always distinguish between imagination and reality, right? The line between make-believe and reality for a 3-year-old is very fuzzy. For a 7-year-old, usually around that age, it's much clearer. And in any case, so at the age of 7, you say, we pray 5 times a day, you got to pray 5 times a day, start getting ready for that, right? Obviously, you might put it in different terms, right? More gently and whatever. But they need to understand that that's what Muslims do. Muslims pray 5 times a day. Must a 7-year-old pray? No, they haven't reached the age of puberty yet, right? They're not yet an adult, and what we mean by adult is not somebody who can drive a car and work as a stockbroker or something like that, right? What we mean is a person who can generally take care of themselves and often others in the most basic and general fashion, and they're held accountable by nature of being of age, reached, sane, of age, and reached by the message, right? Those 3 categories of legal accountability. And there's these, and so what does it mean to be of age? There's a discussion about this, right? But generally, in some societies, girls tended to reach the age of puberty around the age of 9 or so sometimes, right? And boys maybe around the age of 11 or 12, right? So you'll read in these texts that basically the age of adulthood, in this text in particular, is 15, right? It's 15, unless a girl has menstruated somewhere between the age of 9 and 15, or if a boy has experienced a wet dream between roughly that age and or maybe a little bit older and 15, right? So there's certain what are considered the signs of biological adulthood that happen in their normal time frames, right? And so it may be the case in some of the things that I've read that in certain warmer climates, that age of biological adulthood comes a little bit earlier than in northerly or far southerly, colder climates, right? So it may be the case that biological adulthood occurs through the signs of puberty later in some places, on the whole, right? When the text is talking about some of these things, keep in mind that there are assumptions in place that are time, place, and population specific. But in general, we can take the general ruling that if the signs of puberty have not occurred, that just by merely turning 15 years old, one has become an adult, and therefore the rulings of Islamic law apply to that person, right? In the Maliki school, it's 18, right? If the signs of puberty have not occurred, then it's when a person reaches the age of 18. So it's an interesting idea. Why do we consider the age of adulthood in America, at least, to be 18? Some have argued that that's drawn ultimately from exposure to Islamic law, Maliki law in particular. In any case, so just be aware that what we're reading here will be a mix of qat'i and dhanni, right? It will be a mix of absolute certain knowledge and speculative probabilistic knowledge. So the Shafi'i school will have a set of opinions on certain issues that will be different from the Hanafi school and from the Maliki school and the Hanbali school, right? They'll have differences between them, but there will be certain things that they all agree upon, right? So there'll be certain things that are just kind of the absolute, everybody agrees that Maghrib is 3 rakas, right? The evening prayer is 3 units of standing, bowing, and prostrating. Right? But they might disagree about where do you hold your hands. They might disagree about how do you do a particular prayer while you're sitting down, and so on. So those areas are legitimate areas of disagreement, and it's fine for Malikis to look different from Shafis while they're praying. This is not going against the Sunnah of the Prophet. In my brief Maliki days where I prayed with my hands to my side because that's the opinion of the Malikis as opposed to across the chest, which is the opinion of the, or sort of a little bit below. I did that for the camera, but a little bit below for the Shafis. A brother whom I love very much said to me, I heard Sheikh so-and-so say that, all 3 of these ways of praying are fine, but the best way is this way, right? And that the best way that he was talking about was according to the Hanafi school, right? But according to the Maliki school, the best way is to pray with the hands to the side. I think having the literacy of knowing when your imam says the best thing to do is this, it's that they're saying the best thing according to our madhab is this, right? To our approach, is this, unless it's a matter of absolute agreement. So the text that I had you read a number of pages for today is going to begin with the subject of tahara. Right? It's going to begin with the subject of purification. And what this means is how do we purify our limbs, our clothes, and our place of prayer in order to have a valid prayer, right? So I'm assuming we're going to pray Isha shortly, and so we will have to break for a moment pretty soon for that. But in order for that to be valid, I need to have had clean clothes, clean limbs, and clean place of prayer. So then there's going to be the question of how do you do those acts of purification, right? How do you get impurity off your clothes? How do you get impurity off your rug? How do you clean your body of impurities? And also, how do you get ritual purity? How do you do the ablutions and so on? And so there'll be an initial section about the purity of water. right? So it starts with very basic things like what kind of water can you use to do your ablutions with? Can I use grape juice to do that, right? Or is it just water? If it's just water, does it matter if something's mixed with it or not? There's going to be a discussion about what kind of water. For our purposes, we can go to the sink and do our wudu and not worry about it, right? But in general, it's good to know these things because it could be possible that you're camping and something has fallen into the water and you're not sure. It's good to know that these things are, whether or not that water is still valid for ablution or just for drinking, right? Might be that you can drink it, it's pure, but it's not purifying anymore, right? Because you've dropped some food coloring in it, or you've dropped some saffron in it, or you've dropped a Cheerio in it, or whatever it may be. So it's going to talk about making sure that the water is pure. We can teach this in half an hour and just give you the most basic stuff, or you can get into the rulings, since you can understand that, hey, I might face some issues like this throughout my days. So what we're going to do is get a taste of the study of fiqh from a Shafi'i manual that you can personally use in your life in most cases with confidence once you've studied it and understood it. But if you've been raised on the Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, or whatever it may be, it's fine to stay with that as well, as long as you know that well. So I'm assuming we're going to pray soon, so I want to break so that we can hopefully catch the Sunnah prayers. I will be back after the break to answer any questions. And we will continue with a lot of the material that was planned for today. We will, or that was on, I should say, that was on the syllabus for today. We'll continue with a lot of it next time as well. But I'll be back to answer questions and perhaps to introduce a little more material in a moment, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, if you can. Okay, great. Alhamdulillah. Good. So next week we will dig deeper into the actual text on fiqh. We got an introduction to, we sort of finished our introduction to the science of usul of fiqh, and we opened up our discussion of this particular book, the Safinat al-Najah, with the general reminder that this is a book that's going to be filled, it's going to be a combination of matters of certainty and matters of speculation. And that speculation is not a weak word, right? We're not saying, well, we just don't know, right? The idea here is that the scholars of the Shafi'i school have spent a lot of time discussing what they consider to be the strongest possible answer to this various questions about purity and prayer and fasting and so on, according to the methodology of Imam Shafi'i, which was considered to be a very strong and valid method. Now there may be some other things in the commentaries and the explanations and some of the assumptions that might be more cultural, and we'll have to, that doesn't necessarily make them bad, but we'll have to just be aware of that. So it's good to keep in mind that we are taking a text that addresses a time and place that may be different from our own, and we take what's universal and relevant to our times. We take what's universal to all times, we take what's specific and relevant to our times, and if there are some specific details that do not connect to our times, then we need to have an informed understanding of that and know what we should take from the text and what we shouldn't. So we'll unpack that in more detail next time. But I'd like to turn it to you all to see if there are any specific questions that you have about anything that we've discussed today or even last week as well. Okay, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. So, if there's no questions, let me know. I would love to keep on going and keep on reading, but since we didn't announce any sort of extension today, then I don't think that would make sense. But if there are questions, I would love to answer them. Wa iyyakum wa alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah. So just give me, if you're there, if you're hearing this, just let me know. Just say, yes, I have some questions, or no, there are no questions. I don't want to make anybody wait if they have to go. And okay, inshallah, we'll see you next time. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And any questions in the classroom? Okay, so alhamdulillah. So next time, the 5 aims protect the Sharia. The 5 aims, no, this is a very good question. So the 5 aims, these are the 5 aims of the Sharia. So the question is, what does the Sharia aim to protect, right? So this is not that the Sharia needs protection necessarily, right? The Sharia is there to protect these 5 things: the intellect, life, property, and so on. So every ruling, like the prohibition of alcohol, the reason it's prohibited is to protect the intellect. So the Sharia is there to protect the intellect, right? Or among we would say the aims of the rulings of the Sharia, the purpose, we might say the purpose of the Sharia, one of the purposes of the Sharia is to protect the intellect, right? Another purpose of the Sharia is to protect the right to people's property, so that people don't. So theft is impermissible. It is not permissible to steal something. Why? Right? Because people have a right to their property, right? They've bought it, they've earned it, they've inherited it, it's been given to them. However they've obtained it in whatever legal fashion, if it belongs to them, they have that right. So the Sharia aims to, intends to, is there to protect property. Hope that answers your question. I'm happy to answer others if there are any. Great, alhamdulillah. So I've seen that most have signed off, so if there's other questions coming in, let me know. Otherwise, I don't want to keep anyone longer than they would like to stay. So, Jazakumullahu khairan. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Okay. That's when your camera's on, you can't type. There's always something. One thing works, the other thing doesn't. May Allah make it easy. I see people signing back on. I don't want to sign off if there's questions, but wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I think we'll ask Allah to, here we'll just ask Allah to guide us, protect us, increase us in knowledge, cause us to benefit from the knowledge that we're exposed to, forgive us any shortcomings, and make easy for us this path. Shamsia, Sister Shamsia, okay, good, you can hear now. So, did you answer my question? Let me see, did I miss it? There was one, so these are the slides of the previous class, yes. Who is the author of the Distinguished Jurist Primer, if that's the question? I did mention that one, that's right behind my head there, Ibn Rushd. Okay, what was your other question? Maybe you can type it in case I missed it. Okay, so I see previous slides. Let me just go up and see. So, who is the author of the Distinguished Jurist Primer? These are the slides of the previous class, right? Yes. So you're okay. Welcome. Am I missing something? I don't think I see another question here, unless I've missed it. Oh, great. So I didn't see this question. I'm not sure where it is. So do the obligatory acts become obligatory when a child becomes mumayyiz or at puberty? Excellent question. And we'll talk about this again next time. But the obligatory acts become obligatory at puberty as long as puberty comes during the normal times. So if a person has was like a premature onset of puberty, like if a 5-year-old has signs of puberty, for example, and that's a real condition, and I think nowadays they they give medication for that to delay it. But if it happens during the normal times, between 9 and 15 usually, then at puberty the obligations become obligatory, right? So then a person has to pray 5 times a day. So, and that will, it'll differ from society to society in general, like what the norms are, and things are changing in the West. I'm reading articles about this, that there are lots of cases of, sort of early onset of puberty in America and in the West in general, and people are wondering why. Oh, sorry. Yes, I am speaking. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if it's on your end or if it's my end. I do see that the microphone is working, and I think other people have heard what I'm saying. And I can't type either. Oops. Yeah, any thoughts? Sorry. 1 second.
All right, so the sound thing might be
it's on her end, yeah.
End.
But then the typing doesn't work here.
Typing is interesting. Let's see. Hold on 1 second.
It's okay. I think I'll just. Oh, you can hear me now. I'm sorry. Great. So I was answering the question. Good. Okay. So I'll just repeat the answer for your benefit. The question was on the obligation. The obligatory acts like prayer, fasting, and so on, they become an obligation at puberty, as long as puberty occurs within the normal ranges, right? And so I mentioned the case of like if somebody is 5 years old and they have the signs of puberty, that's considered an abnormal early onset of puberty, and that would not mean that they would not be required to pray and fast at age 5, right? And I think nowadays there's medication for that. So the idea is that when a person reaches puberty during the normal times, then the obligatory acts become an obligation. So usually like a 12 or 13-year-old, in this society, or 11-year-old, they would have to start praying. Now, don't just take from the text and follow it. There's something about reminding kids, and it says something like beat them if they don't pray. We want to discuss the word beat next time. But in general, the idea is that once you hit biological adulthood, or if the signs of puberty don't occur, then once you reach the age of 15, that's when these things become an obligation. And of course, something like fasting can be difficult and different for different people. So a 12-year-old who turns 12 in the middle of July, for example, might have a different experience with fasting than somebody who turns 12 in the middle of December when Ramadan falls in December. So we'll talk about this more next time, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Always feel free to send me emails or post to the announcements, and I'll be happy to do my best to get back to you in a timely fashion, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wa ma'as salama. Have a good night, everyone.